No, like Karen said, GA is a big meeting of Unitarian Universalists that occurs every year, gives us an opportunity to be in the Church of the Wider Fellowship, which is what we call all Unitarian Universalists, and to take care of some business of the association. So we're going to have a conversation this morning mostly about the changes to Article 2, which is our shared covenant. That's going to be really the meat of our conversation. But we thought that it was important for those delegates who attended, who represented the CVUU, to give an account of their time. And so we could also, celebrate them a little bit, because it takes time to go to GA. The business sessions are long, and while they're very important, they require a lot of focus. So it's also an opportunity to shine just a bit of light on them and say thank you for your service to the CVUU and the Church of the Wider Fellowship. Will each of you give a little account of your experience? Okay. I'm going to say Madison, an older white female. Gremlin.
Getting that microphone or not get lost.
Okay, I'm Mary Kay Madsen, an older white female with white hair and blue glasses, similar in color to the first pair of glasses I got when I was in first grade. I have on a multicolored vest and that is quilted with a cantha stitch. I live on the lands that several different Native American tribes have lived on over the centuries. Each person who spoke at General Assembly introduced themselves this way throughout the proceedings. It was interesting to listen to what people described about themselves and definitely showed our diversity. I participated virtually, either via Zoom, Huva, or YouTube, all platforms for experiencing GA. I tried all of them during the 4 days. Some of them were better than others, and they all had their pluses and minuses. I'm not going to go into those. Once registered as a delegate, I received lots of emails discussing our responsibilities as a delegate, information about what would happen, advice to not get overwhelmed, and what the schedule was for assorted virtual meetings prior to GA. I attended most of the pre-GA sessions. By being a virtual participant, I could participate in the business meetings, the worship services, and workshop sessions. And I could stay focused on listening to the discussions about the final 15 amendments to Article 2 proposal and listen to the divestment proposal information. I just want you to know it's my privilege to represent CVUU as a delegate at GA.
Well, this was my fifth or sixth GA. I've kind of lost count. I can't remember. And while it was not an entirely pleasant experience for me, which I'll go into later, but it was a very much a scaled down GA in comparison to the ones that I had attended in the past. Many fewer workshops. There used to be 30 workshops you could go to, and I think I only attended a total of one workshop the whole time I was there. So I suppose I understand the financial reasons for that, but I suppose that was a little disappointing. So I spent my mornings playing so that I could gear up for the business meeting in the afternoon. One morning I took a bike ride, which was a lot of fun. One morning I went to the Natural History Museum. I suppose some people probably think I belong there with the dinosaurs, but you know, I enjoyed that. And so it was, and the worship services I attended were very good. You know, they're always able to get, you know, top quality musicians. You know, naturally the national group can attract, you know, the best of the best in terms of musicians and preachers. So I guess that's kind of an overview.
This was my first GA that I've gone to. How many of you have been to GA before? Okay, so there's only a couple. Well, some here. How many of you have been to an academic conference or some kind of I don't know what I'm going to just use this one. Okay. So how many of you have been to either an academic conference or some kind of retreat or conference? Almost all of you. So you can picture kind of what it was like. Now, it was my first time, and I don't generally have like a very optimistic viewpoint of what national leadership would be in any large organization or anything that feels like an academic conference. I sort of expect that I'm going to go and hear a lot of empty words. And so I am pleased to say that it was different than I expected. It was a really wonderful experience for me to connect with a lot of people outside of CVUU. This is my first exposure to Unitarian Universalists. And so I didn't know what was common or normal outside this congregation. So I spent a lot of time in small meetups that people, just attendees would post meetups covering different subjects and discussions on the Hoover app. The Hoover app was pretty terrible, but the meetups were great. And so I only attended one workshop, but I attended a lot of meetups with small groups of people all over the country and got to talk to them about what their congregations were like, what some of the things they did, and listening to the services and the meetings. Anyway, it was wonderful. It was much more fascinating and interesting than I expected. And I think because it wasn't just empty words, there was always practical actions that they were trying to back everything up with. So
I think this was my fourth GA, because when I arrived here in September of 2018 GA had already happened, but it was only my second in-person GA, because we all know what happened when the world changed in spring of 2020. GA for me has one of my main loves of attending GA is reconnecting with colleagues. You've heard me talk about my cohort. I have a small cohort of UU ministers that are around my age. So I got to spend time with them. And then I have lots and lots of minister friends that are internet friends. I've never met them in person. And GA always gives me an opportunity to turn my internet friends into in-person, real-life friends. And I've met so many people online because of the way that things have shifted since 2020, that there were people that were greeting me that I was really having trouble placing them in context. Mandy and I walked in the banner parade, which was not... Can you turn this mic down just a little bit, Ken? I'm getting an echo. We walked in the banner. Thank you. We walked in the banner parade. And as we're walking in the parade, this woman yelled, "Emma!" And I turned and I looked at her and she said, "Hi, oh, it's so good to meet you." And she gave me this huge hug and it was so warm and wonderful. And I have no idea who she was. And I still don't know. I never saw her again. I know she's my friend. She was so excited to see me. I don't know who. I think she said her name was Anna. I don't know who she was. So that can be GA sometimes. And the thing about the workshops, it's true there are less workshops in person. There are so many things online. And if you register to go to GA, whether you're in person or virtual, I think for a year or for a long time, through the end of September, you have access to all of these virtual workshops and trainings. So there's really an incredible wealth of materials and info just for registering for GA. So Mary Kay mentioned the divestment proposal. There was a proposal given by the Youth Caucus to divest fully from fossil fuels that did not pass. So there were other business things that happened, but we're mostly going to talk about Article 2. So a question that we've gotten a lot when the Article 2 process began is, why are we doing this? One of our earliest ministers said that revelation is continuous. Unitarian Universalists are very proud to be involved in a living faith, right? Things are always changing around us. We don't have doctrine. We don't have a gospel, which I think gives us opportunities to reevaluate how we practice our faith and our religion in the world. So it is in our bylaws that every 15 years, we will reconsider Article 2, which is our shared covenant that up until very recently contained the 7 principles. The UUA board creates a commission to study the text of Article 2, to reach out to the Church of the Wider Fellowship, and to offer amendments or changes to Article 2. So that's why we're in this process now. The last successful revision of Article 2 occurred in 1985, and this followed a grassroots movement pioneered by women who had gotten sick and tired of all of the brotherhood and the man this and man that language that was contained in our original Article 2, which of course was written when Unitarianism and Universalism merged in 1961. So all of these women in their own individual congregations connected themselves together, and they demanded amendments to Article 2, and it was successful. And then in 1995, the 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web, was added. In 2009, changes to Article 2 were voted down from progressing at General Assembly. We've had a bit of a challenging time digging up an account of this information, but we were finally able to find some things. Mary Kay said to me this morning that the reason that these changes were voted down in 2009 is because and it wasn't a commission, it was the trustees or the folks that ran GA that were not accountable to the UUA. They became the study commission. I'm muddling this. That's my understanding. At GA on the floor, they disallowed time for amendments. And so once the Church of the Larger Fellowship heard that we weren't going to be able to wordsmith their changes, we were like, absolutely not. And we voted it down. And then I guess there was a follow-up in 2014 that was also voted down. I read an article in UU World interviewing a woman named Reverend Diane Miller, who was on the 1984 commission group that gave us these 7 principles here. She told in the article, there's a very interesting story about how she was pregnant at the time that the process began, and her baby was born just around the time that we passed the new Article 2. And I just want to read some quotes from her. She says, "Times change. We have changed. Hallelujah. A statement of who we are in our own words need not be fixed in generations past." Her reflection on the 2023 process. this was very interesting. She said, and we find evidence of this in everything that we've read, we heard just about exactly the same arguments you are hearing now. People say, our present statement has served us well for over 20 years. Why tamper now? You hear that today, or that's what they were hearing in 1985, and it's what we're hearing today. And some folks argued, well, this shouldn't be a top priority. There's so much else going on, or that it would create divisiveness and confusion. All arguments that they heard in 1985 and all arguments we've heard today. And this is her quote about what she loves most about the changes from the commission. I would say what struck me most is that love is at the center, and love is the word that now captures so much of what is special, what is holy, what is divine. This is participatory theology. It is inclusive and alive. I am hopeful that we will together forge a new statement for these times. Mary Kay has been deeply involved in this process from the beginning. She really is our resident expert. And so we've asked her to explain the process that we've been through and the process going forward.
So I'm going to kind of skip through what I had written because Emma has now covered some of what I had written. Okay, I move my head a lot and I use my hands a lot when I talk. This is very inhibiting. Okay, so as we think about the Article 2 as it currently exists, not what was amended, but what is currently in existence, we have 4 different sections. There were the principles, and they're not the principles like this, but how we see the principles of our UU faith. The purposes, inclusion, and all the words that go along with this, and freedom of belief. Those were 4 very important concepts when this was written. The information I'm sharing is from an article on the UUA website, and we have found lots of articles on the UUA website. Some of them good, some of them but we will post them so that if you want to do some checking, you won't have to do some of the deep searching that we have done. Article 2, as it was originally conceived, is one of the what's called the C bylaws, dating back to the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Association in 1961. Much of the C laws reflect the compromises that were made to achieve that merger. Different pieces of the C bylaws were important enough to each side that they were made harder to change in the future, as opposed to other bylaws that were implemented at that same time, or what's called the non-C bylaws. So they made it from the get-go very difficult to change the C bylaws. The first major rewrite post-merger was adopted in 1984. How many of you remember that process? Oh, no hands going up. I can remember that process. At that point in time, I was in the Iowa City congregation, and we had a number of, as I remember them, I don't want to call them contentious because they weren't contentious, but they were very firm. There were firm people on one side and firm people on the other side, and getting rid of words like manhood and brotherhood were, oh my gosh, not what some people, I won't say who they were, wanted to do. So this is the article, what was passed back in 1984 with a few minor revisions like the addition of 7. It's what we've got today. But if these articles will talk about, okay, here's some of the wording we want. As I think about that and some of the amendments that people were proposing, We've got people who have been proposing the same kinds of wording changes all the way through. I don't know that that's good or bad. It just is. The principles that we've got guide our actions and our priorities, encouraging us to affirm and promote core values, while the sources provide the context and grounding for those purposes and principles. They go hand in hand. The article states that our purpose is our very reason for being. Section 2.3 of the C bylaws commits us to being inclusive and to replacing barriers that have kept some people and groups from full participation in our faith. It's a work in progress, that full participation. For some religious institutions, the equivalent of Article 2 would be regarded as a permanent statement of belief. Our faith, however, is a living tradition. By our bylaws, we commit ourselves to regularly revisiting our principles and purposes to ensure that they are relevant, and that as we grow in understanding our principles and purposes, we grow. I want to talk just for a few minutes, maybe highlight some things that Emma didn't cover, and as we think about the timelines. So 1961 is when the original stuff is created. Then, and that comes from the Unitarians who were formed in 1847, and the Universalist Church that was formed in 1866. So those were two groups with long histories. So the adoption of the reformulated Article 2 in 1984 was driven by women. They didn't like all those old words that were being used. If you think about today, there's a lot of old words still hanging in there that are words we don't use anymore. And so one of the things is they're trying to update some things. An example is in that original stuff, it spent time talking about how we aspire to Judeo-Christian beliefs. Well, that's true then, and it's still true now, but we look at those beliefs in a much broader way. And we think about the groups who have come and joined us and who are coming from a variety of different places. So let's talk for just a minute about the process for the new Article 2. The commission was formed and we talked about that. And so it's been a 3-year process. In January, after receiving the commission's draft of Article 2, the Board of Trustees for the UUA began developing a congregational engagement and amendment process, a 4-phase process for doing this whole process that we've been in this last year. As amendments to Article 2 became available, I started reading. There was over 400 amendments. Some put out by individuals, some put out by groups, some put out by congregations. Again, as you read them, there's a lot of repetition. There's some things that people are really attached to in different kinds of ways. I would encourage you to check the UUA website for additional details of the process because it is spelled out fairly completely. The final version of, how do I want to say that? It's not the final version. It's the current version of Article 2 as amended by the 2023 Assembly needed a simple majority to move forward. So what happened is they ultimately picked 15 amendments that we were going to vote on that I think they picked based on what I'm reading from. These were the amendments that were receiving lots of comments, or they looked at them and said, oh, Amendment 28, Amendment 800, whatever, the number really were the same thing with different people saying it. They also looked for those amendments that were supported by people. So those were the amendments that we voted on, 15 of them. We did 3 days of votes. And what would happen is the person who had proposed the amendment got to say, this is why I proposed the amendment. In the case of a group, that person was speaking for the group. So they did that first, and then they would go through and people could speak up and say, this is why I support the amendment. This is why I don't support the amendment. At the end of the day, we would vote. We had until 10 o'clock at night. These guys could have conversations with people during that time. I just did my normal stuff, and I would go, oh, I got to get my vote in. I would think about, I would say, I would listen very carefully to what people were saying, and then I would make a decision on whether I was going to vote pro or con. The next morning, they would give us the results, and then we would go through the next section of stuff. The Article 2 proposal is subject to amendment in 2024 only by a 3/4 vote in favor of an amendment submitted to the General Assembly in writing by the Board of Trustees. So the Board of Trustees can still make an amendment. In addition to that, if a group, a minimum group of 15 people come together, or not 15 people, 15 congregations come together, they can also support an amendment. And that's the kinds of things that will be voted on next year. At that point in time, again, they would talk about, and that we would have pros and cons again presented. We would vote, and then we would have that amendment or the Article 2 voted on, and it will need a vote of 2/3 of the delegates there. There's a potential, there was a big discussion about this, there's a potential of about 3,000 delegates. There were about 2,400 delegates that were voting each day. So there were people that were not voting, or there were congregations who did not send delegates or didn't send their full complement of delegates. So that's the point that we're at. We're going to get now then what is the revised Article 2. We'll look at that, read it, and then they'll go forward with the process. Next year will be an all virtual GA, and that's something that was a decision made several years ago. So it will be interesting to see how that operates. There you go.
Okay, I'm on. Yeah, great. I've heard a lot of talk about change and the process of change and how people are resistant to change and how the process of change is part of who we are as UU. And I certainly agree with that. And I also agree that people do have a lot of problems sometimes accepting any kind of change, even a minor change that causes us to do things differently than what we did. That's something that it's a little hard for us to adjust to a lot of times. But I want to push back on the notion that people who may have specific objections to this specific proposal are somehow against change altogether. I think it's unfair to characterize people who may have problems with this specific change as being resistant to change in general, because that's certainly not the case with me. And so I want us to be careful that we don't kind of dismiss out of hand anybody that wants to raise issues about this by just saying, oh, well, you're just stuck in the past. You just don't like change, period. And I just have to push back against that, because I think that's not fair. Now, if you're proposing a fundamental change in the way our covenant is presented, which is what is being proposed, and you're asking people to vote on that change, then there ought to be an opportunity for clear and honest dialogue where the old is clearly presented and the new is presented, and the pros and cons of each alternative are discussed and evaluated. Then a person can say either I really like the old or I really like the new, and then vote accordingly. Now, I realize that opportunities for dialogue have been offered for several months, as Mary Kay outlined. And I participated in one of these, and frankly, I did not feel really listened to. I felt like it was more like, thank you for your input, and then on with the process. I didn't feel like there was any dialogue going on between whoever was offering the opportunity and people that might have a different point of view. So, and maybe it was just I didn't tune in at the right time or something, but that experience kind of discouraged me from future participation, because I thought, is this real dialogue or is this just pro forma? But by the time the GA arrived, from my perspective, the process was totally rigged in favor of the new option, because Mary Kay mentioned the 15 amendments. Well, as I say, she said they'd been winnowed down from 400, but somebody else made that decision. I understand you couldn't have 400 amendments; that would be impossible. But so we were really given a very limited range of things to vote on, and most of the things we were voting on were really tweaks of the new one rather than any. There was one attempt to reinstate the old, but it was piled on top of the new, and I voted against that. That didn't make any sense. So it just seemed to me that anybody that wanted the opportunity to say, well, our 7 principles have a lot of strengths. They have very clear language. They're very forceful language, and that I prefer that more clear and forceful language to what's being proposed. There really was not an equitable opportunity to put that on the table. And I know back when the 8th principle was proposed, that there was a lot of opposition to the 8th principle based, I think, on basically defense of white privilege. And somehow I think for some people, maybe if you were defending the old 7 principles, somehow you were tarred with that brush of defending white privilege. Not entirely, but there was some indication. And as you know, I was a strong advocate of the 8th principle, and I certainly was not, and I was very much in favor of that change. Frankly, I think the new way of incorporating the 8th principle actually, in some sense, weakens it, but I can get into that argument another time. And then the wording on the final vote, I think, was somewhat loaded, because basically you weren't explicitly being asked to vote for or against the changes. You were being asked to vote for or against further discussion of the changes. So you felt like if you were voting no, you were voting against further discussion, which certainly was not my intention to vote against further discussion. So that seemed to me that it would encourage people to vote, to not vote no if they were being perceived as, well, I don't want to talk about this anymore. So, and I'm participating in this service because I believe it's my obligation as a delegate to do so. And I really don't think there's a whole lot of merit in continuing to discuss in our congregation the old versus the new, even though I know there are other people in the congregation that share really my preference for the old versus the new. Because I mean, it's a moot point. I mean, you got the old Kenny Rogers song says you got to know when to hold them, you got to know when to fold them, right? It's continued struggle over the old versus the new, as I think been kind of read out of the process. And so personally, I'm not really interested in spending a whole lot of time trying to argue that point anymore. I'm simply saying that my perception of the process was that I felt kind of marginalized, kind of railroaded out of the discussion. There was no real genuine opportunity for me to present my point of view. And naturally, I came away very, very disappointed and upset by that process.
for participating, Al. Yes. So a brief explanation of the eighth principle. That was a grassroots movement. So again, not connected to the UUA, of folks who got together and they wanted to write a principle specifically about dismantling racism, structures of white supremacy, and other oppressions. The woman who was the lead of the eighth principle project actually was a member of the Article 2 Study Commission. It's already 11 o'clock. We're going to wrap this up. Mandy has some brief comments, and then I'm going to read the preliminary changes to Article 2 initially given to us by the Commission, because I think it's important.
Very briefly, if you really want to know what I think, talk to me later. But it was a beautiful experience for me to see the very messy and human effort at democracy, sincere effort of democracy in discussion with so many people, with so many views, and to see how hard they worked at getting everybody to talk together respectfully and to give everyone possible that they could in such a venue a voice. I was impressed and I loved the process. And my favorite vote was when I voted for the amendment for peace to be added to the values. And I thought, what a bold and almost insanely hopeful vote to make that one of the stated values in the world we have right now. And I loved.
So we have a year before we finalize whether or not we're going to instate this new Article 2 into our wider polity. We have a year to teach it, to learn the text, to preach it, to march with it, to use it in our RE classrooms, and to experiment with how this new Article 2 can transform our faith. I think often a lot of the criticism that I hear right off the bat with these 6 values, love at the center, interdependence, plurality, justice, all of those, is that it's too simple. It's too simple. Those words are too simple. But people have not actually read this new proposal to Article 2 in its entirety. It's not terribly long, so we're going to read it now. Dave, if you could put up the slide. I'm going to read this in its entirety, and I invite you to practice deep listening. So however you listen best, whether you read along with me or you close your eyes, I want you to really let these words sink into your bones. And I would love to hear, maybe after the service today, what resonates the most with you. Or if you have, some sort of knee-jerk reaction to a word, tell me that too. But I'd love to hear, when you've really listened to these words, how they make you feel. Section C21, Purposes. The Unitarian Universalist Association will devote its resources and its organizational powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. Its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries, support and train leaders, both lay and professional, to foster lifelong faith formation, to heal historic injustices, and to advance our Unitarian Universalist values in the world. The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together, and it is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are love, justice, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, and generosity. Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish Earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive, democratic process to make decisions. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Generosity. We cult a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Inspirations. As Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons who share our values. We commit to being an association of congregations that empowers and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities. Freedom of belief. Congregational freedom and the individual's right to conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union, so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. Thank you to our delegates and our panelists this morning. Thank you for your service to this congregation and to the wider Unitarian Universalist Association.